Thank you. And
So whenever you're ready, Justin, you can share your screen.
great. Thanks, Karen. And good morning again, all. Hopefully you are seeing
Oh, we just lost your screen share. There it's coming back now.
great.
There we go.
So good morning, all. Just as a reminder, this is the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, Bay Act Resiliency Update, and Adapt Virginia Overview. We appreciate everyone's patience and joining us this morning. We'll go ahead and get started. So during the webinar, we do ask that folks are muted. This will allow us to be able to go forward with the presentation, share the information that we have for individuals here today, as well as being able to provide and get comments and questions during the webinar, which we'll be addressing as well. Again, this webinar is being held as a part of an informal comment period as a follow-up to the Bay Act resiliency work that's been done around guidance and the development of additional tools, as well as being able to provide an overview of Adapt VA. As this is a webinar attached to an informal comment period, though, the idea is to provide additional information on updates to tools in Adapt Virginia, but this is not a forum for comments. As indicated on both the town hall as well as the DEQ website, if you have comments on the revised updated draft guidance or the tools or otherwise, to please submit those to Heather Mackey at DEQ. We will be answering questions at the end after both my presentation as well as Karen from VIMS. And as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the DEQ website for folks to be able to view later on as well. I'll quickly cover our agenda items. We're going to do a brief round of introductions from the DEQ and VIMS folks, provide some additional context and background around what we're talking about, how we got here, and the history of the Bay Act resiliency efforts. We'll talk and provide an overview of the guidance update and the tools that have been provided in conjunction with that, and then turn it over to VIMS, who will provide an Adapt Virginia overview for folks to be able to see how Adapt Virginia works, particularly with the use of layers and the connection to the resiliency assessment and the efforts we're talking about today. We'll close out with some examples and then answer questions. Questions may be answered during the chat, that those can be spoken to directly, but will be revisited. Or if folks are having technical issues, we have folks available to assist with that as well. And then we'll talk about next steps and closing out the steps moving forward for the proposed revised guidance and tools. So in terms of introductions, I'll turn on my video briefly just to introduce myself. So good morning, I'm Justin Williams. I'm the manager for the Office of Watersheds and Local Government Assistance at DEQ. That office includes, on the watershed side, our TMDL implementation and grants program, but directly relevant to our discussion today on the local government assistance includes our Bay Act program. We also have joining us today from DEQ, Heather Mackey. Heather is our technical reviewer and program coordinator for the Bay Act program, and will be providing and collecting the comments that are provided on the draft guidance and tools, and then I'll turn it over to VIMS.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen During. I'm hosting the Zoom session today, and I'm also going to be providing the Adapt VA interactive map overview for you. I'm a coastal scientist here at VIMS, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, or CCRM. And it's our job to help support agencies like DEQ and to connect science and policy through efforts like this. Joining us also today is Pam Mason. Pam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks. Took me a minute to get off mute. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm Pam Mason, and I'm also at the Center for Coastal Resources Management, Virginia Institute of Marine Science, working with Karen. And collaboratively, we worked on the helping develop some of these data layers and data tools that Karen is going to demonstrate through Adapt Virginia to be able to support the decision making around this policy that DEQ is putting forth. So I'm glad to see everybody here today and hope we're able to answer all your questions. Thank you.
And also helping us today as a co-host and Zoom technician is Cersei Gonzalez. She's the Coastal Training Coordinator at the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, Virginia. She is a Coastal Training Coordinator and is very helpful in helping manage Zoom events like this. So thank you, Cersei. Okay, back to you, Justin.
Thank you all. So as way of background, as many folks may be aware, the Virginia Code and the sections related to the Bay Act provisions and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act were amended in 2020. Specifically, those provisions dealing with the performance criteria that is required to be established by the State Water Control Board to be incorporated into local programs who are implementing the Bay Act. It specifically added language around coastal resilience and adaptation to sea level rise and climate change among those criteria. Following up from the statutory amendment in 2020 were the regulatory amendments to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Designation and Management Act regulations, and those did include specific provisions requiring the incorporation into the plan of development or project review process, these provisions related to addressing resiliency. It was based upon and established that looking at and considering resiliency should be determined upon the RPA as delineated at the time of proposed development, and that when looking at particularly sea level rise, it should be based upon a period of 30 years or a lifespan of the project if less than 30 years. It also established the requirement for the use of a model or forecast developed by or on behalf of the Commonwealth, specifically looking at sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. One of the models identified is Adapt Virginia, which we'll be talking about today. It also required that a resiliency assessment look at the potential impacts on buffer function as well as the proposed project when looking at the proposal. As a result of that assessment, it did identify that localities which could require the assessment to either be conducted by the applicant or conducted themselves, identify conditions, alterations, or adaptation measures to address those additional potential impacts as necessary. The provision also included, separate from the resiliency assessment, and we'll talk a little bit with regards to the tools update, provisions related to the allowance for adaptation measures, and included additional provisions related to living shorelines, reconciliation with tidal wetlands guidelines, as well as requirements around the use of fill for adaptation measures. The regulations did establish a time frame for local adoption, but understanding and recognizing the time that it has taken and ensuring that localities have the most available information and tools and assistance by DEQ. DEQ has worked with and identified that from a compliance standpoint, we would really anticipate that localities would have adoption by September of 2025. We'll continue to work with localities and look at timeframes to make sure that ultimately localities have what they need to be able to adopt these provisions, understanding the timing and the processes that are required to do so. Prior to the updates that we'll talk about today, including the guidance and tools, there was a prior effort working both in conjunction with VIMS and at the time, William and Mary's Coastal Policy Center, development of a draft guidance. Now, that draft guidance was put out for informal comment. We received approximately 11 sets of comments, focused largely on provisions related to the illustrations and examples, wanting to have an Adapt Virginia overview to help better understand and provide context for this assessment, as well as the request for additional tools. So in light of that, we have now put out for, and I'll discuss, these guidance and tools updates. So first and foremost, we did update the guidance in response to those comments received and to provide additional clarity, including particularly around the examples and accompanying illustrations to demonstrate the application of the resiliency assessment. We appreciate tremendously the generosity of WPL of Virginia Beach, who provided assistance with the development of the illustrations to accompany the examples. We revised the narratives to better flow with the requirements and steps in resiliency assessment, and we also provided clarification in text around certain provisions, emphasizing, for example, that localities could require the assessment to be completed by the applicant. Most of the revisions did focus upon the actual examples, as well as setting up for and recognizing the other requests for ADAPT Virginia as mentioned, and the additional tools. In addition to the updated guidance and accompanying examples document, which was established separately as a document to aid in the review, was the development of the additional tools. This includes a model ordinance. The model ordinance offers regulatory language based upon the resiliency and tree amendments alongside a traditional Bay Act ordinance model. As many folks may recall, at the same time as the statutory amendments with regard to resiliency, there was a statutory amendment related to tree planting and tree preservation. While there continues to be separate efforts to address those revisions, which were already incorporated into regulations through updates to the buffer manual, understanding the process and timing of localities' efforts for ordinance revisions, this model ordinance does provide for tree amendment language for localities' considerations. As mentioned and requested by many commenters and localities, the model ordinance does provide a framework and language that assumes an applicant's completion of a resiliency assessment. Most importantly, the model ordinance does allow for and recognize for adoption or customization of ordinance changes to align with the existing provisions. Most importantly, that localities may have a different structure or form for how their Bay Act requirements are outlined. The model ordinance is not designed to be the only means of language or framework for localities to adopt, but rather to provide an example of where new requirements may fit in within an existing Bay framework, while also in providing the additional language for consideration of the tree amendments and for recognizing additional practices or information from other localities related to other general Bay Act requirements, such as woodlot management, and incorporating those considerations into a model ordinance. Ultimately, the regulatory language provides the guide for localities and the requirements that have to be incorporated into the local ordinance. And that does include certain decision-making along the way. Recognizing that, one of the additional tools that were developed was the locality implementation checklist. This checklist provides decision points for localities based upon allowances and decisions that are outlined in the regulations. It provides both pre-implementation and adoption considerations and decisions for localities to consider, such as the category of storm surge, or whether or not the locality will require the applicant to conduct the assessment, or take advantage of additional allowances, such as not requiring a water quality impact assessment for a living shoreline. This locality implementation checklist is designed to be used in conjunction with the model ordinance to provide a guide and tool to assist localities. But it is indeed only that, a tool. Localities are not required to submit this checklist to DEQ, but rather to use it as a tool when considering the decisions that are required and the steps that have to be taken for implementation consideration. Additionally, a resiliency assessment template was provided. This was again based upon assumptions from the regulations, such as the applicant conducting the initial assessment and collecting of information. Localities can tailor this assessment template and the assessment requirements into existing forms and processes, such as their water quality impact assessment. In particular, As localities look at and consider the extent of potential impact across their Bay Act properties or localities, they may find that, for example, amending the existing water quality impact assessment to incorporate and demonstrate that resiliency was considered is a more straightforward approach. Others may wish to have and maintain separately water quality impact assessments and resiliency assessment templates. Both are fine and allowable under the regulations, but most importantly, this template is designed to guide and identify the information that should be gathered by localities in considering and addressing the resiliency assessment. As mentioned, the regulatory amendments and recognizing the provision for resiliency allowed for, specifically within the resource protection area, the allowance created an allowance for adaptation measures. Those measures designed to address those very impacts that are addressed or considered under resiliency. In particular, in considering adaptation measures as outlined in the regulations, consideration as to the type, considering the source, as well as the makeup of the adaptation measure is an important part of those considerations. This checklist is designed to provide a template for reviewing those adaptation measures. Again, it can be adapted to existing forms and processes. Additionally, given the required sources that are identified in the regulatory amendment related to best management practices, a nature-based adaptation measure list was developed. This is based upon identifying existing best management practices from the sources outlined, including Stormwater Chesapeake Bay and the Community Flood Grant Guidelines. Again, localities may recommend or request inclusion of additional BMPs. The purpose of the list is not to be all-inclusive or to identify specific types or products of BMPs which may fit within the framework of those sources that are allowed, but rather to identify those categories and specific additional sources under those identified in the regulation. In particular, the Community Flood Grant Guidelines have factors and considerations for recognition of nature-based adaptation measures. And this, of course, checklist or list rather does not capture every potential BMP. We understand that knowing the full universe or opportunity of BMPs that may be considered for an adaptation measure is important for localities. And we'll continue to work with localities if specific requests or questions arise regarding them. Most importantly, recognition under the regulations for a nature-based adaptation measure includes those natural features and environmental processes and support the overall continuity of the buffer and its function under the Bay Act. Additional tools that have been developed was the Adapt Virginia User Guide, which Karen will speak about more. And this provides an overview of features and layers. This aligns with that information that was included upon the forefront of the examples guidance as to consideration of features and layers, specifically working through the process in Adapt Virginia, as well as to provide additional helpful layers and information that can be obtained from Adapt Virginia. Listening to comments and understanding the implementation of particularly consideration of the sea level rise, the intervals requiring the minimum of 30 years, or unless the lifespan is shorter, DEQ worked with VIMS to develop a new Adapt Virginia layer. It provides for shorter time intervals for consideration in terms of the time frame of application for a certain period of years, as well as to emphasize and show significant sea level rise, that which is greater than 6 inches. This layer can provide useful information, particularly as localities are looking at any projects or applicants are looking at projects and trying to determine the significance and to the extent of any sea level rise that is projected on the parcel. And Karen will show this layer during her portion of the presentation, and we'll talk about its incorporation as well in consideration in the examples. One last item I would also note that is currently under QA/QC is the development of a singular CBPA GIS layer that depicts the resource protection areas, resource management areas, and intensely developed areas within each locality. The department, working with localities to obtain either shapefile or GIS data, or through the digitization of adopted maps, created this layer. It's currently available. It is currently being QA/QC by localities and then will be made publicly available, including incorporated into Adapt Virginia. This layer will then allow for and depict those areas as adopted by localities and help and aid with applying the additional resiliency considerations and layers available in Adapt Virginia. That provides a general overview as the guidance or tools. We'll talk some more with regards to the application of those as we talk about the examples and answer questions. We look forward to folks' feedback on those guidance and tools, as well as opportunities that we'll have for additional outreach to talk about any of the particulars as to the Bay Act resiliency requirements for the guidance and tools that were developed. At this point, we're going to turn over the presentation to Karen, who's going to provide an Adapt Virginia overview, looking at the layers and information that's available to localities and others in consideration of the resiliency assessment. Karen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, you should be seeing my slide now. Can you confirm that, Justin?
Yes, I can, and we can hear you. Thanks, Karen.
Excellent. As Justin said, the next part of this webinar will provide an overview of the Adapt VA interactive map viewer, where resiliency models and data layers can be found. Adapt VA is a web portal dedicated to climate change adaptations by integrating best available science with legal guidance and planning strategies. Adapt VA was first launched in 2017 by partners from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, William & Mary, and Wetlands Watch. The site is presently maintained by the VIMS Center for Coastal Resources Management. There are 5 major resource sections in Adapt VA that contain interactive map viewers, story maps, policy guides, and more. This Adapt VA portal provides a variety of resources and tools related to water level trends and forecasts, flood risk tools, planning and policy resources, and adaptation case studies illustrated through story maps. The Adapt VA interactive map is a digital mapping platform in this portal that integrates data and models from multiple sources from other parts of the website. And that's what I'm going to be reviewing for you today. This map viewer can be launched from the Adapt VA Tools section. As Justin mentioned, a user guide and related quick guides have also been produced to support this tool, and we will provide a link for you at the end of this overview. When the map viewer first opens, the layout has a GIS layer list on the left and a map display on the right. This layout resizes automatically for different screens. Generally, it's easier to view maps like this on larger desktop screens, but it also works on tablets and smartphones. The user can decide which layers to display and how open windows are arranged using standard map navigation controls. A list of help and information questions is open by default when you first go to the map. You can leave this window open while you're using the tool, or you can close it and then open it when you need it. You can also change the base map with several options, including different aerial imagery and different topographic maps. The GIS layer list has 6 main categories with a variety of data layers under each one. Each category can be expanded and collapsed by clicking on the small arrows. The small I symbol has more information about a category or data layer. Additional details are also available in the help information under the question, how do I find information about the layers? And here's a tip for smaller screens. Various map windows might collapse or disappear behind symbols. So look for the layer list symbol shown here to find this list of data layers that you can display on the map. The GIS data layers to support the resiliency assessments can be found in all 6 of these categories. The purpose of this overview is to show you where to find some of these data layers to conduct the assessments, while also demonstrating some tips to make navigation in the map viewer easier. Each main category contains subcategories that group similar data layers together. In order to see the GIS data layers on the map, boxes must be checked next to the main category at the top of the layer list, next to the subcategory if there is one, and the data layer of interest to see it on the map display. Here is an example with the natural resources category expanded. At the top, the main category is checked, and so is tidal marsh, so this data layer is displayed on the map. But notice how the data layers for non-tidal wetlands and submerged aquatic vegetation are checked, but their subcategory boxes are not checked, so they do not show up on this map. Now, all of the right display boxes are checked for the main category natural resources, the subcategories by habitat type, and the actual GIS data layers. All of the selected features are now displayed together on the map. If a data layer is not displayed as you expected it to, make sure all of these boxes are checked. Now that we've reviewed some of the basic map display and navigation controls, let's review where to find information needed for resiliency assessments, starting with existing conditions. To find a parcel location, you can simply enter an address in the Find Address or Place field. You can also zoom to or find coordinates. There's a Virginia parcels layer located under the infrastructure category and the general infrastructure subcategory. Virginia parcel boundaries are one of the scale-dependent layers that are grayed out until a suitable scale is reached by zooming in or out. For parcel boundaries to appear, you must zoom in close enough until the layer becomes available. The shoreline management category or tab on the map viewer has the Bay Act specific data layers Justin referred to. These layers can be used to evaluate the existing location of regulated features as well as how features are expected to shift or migrate over time. This includes a 100-foot resource protection area buffer layer that was generated by VIMS, the new DEQ GIS layer that Justin referenced will be added here when it becomes available. The special sea level rise layers are here also, including how the shoreline and wetlands are expected to shift landward by 2050. And this is also where the 5-year sea level rise interval data layer is located. And we'll talk more about the sea level rise related layers later. Existing natural features are mapped under the natural resources category. This includes tidal marshes from the VIMS tidal marsh inventory and other wetlands located near the shorelines. There's a hydrology data layer with flow lines for streams and rivers, as well as artificial channels. There's also a topographic contours layer, which is another scale-dependent layer that comes from the National Elevation Dataset. Looking at existing wetlands is always an important part of these assessments. Existing tidal and non-tidal wetlands can be displayed together by combining the tidal marsh data layer with a layer called wetlands less than 10 feet of elevation. This example shows how tidal and non-tidal wetlands are connected near a developed area. There's another available layer that shows non-tidal wetlands throughout Virginia from the NWI, or National Wetlands Inventory. Existing shoreline stabilization structures and output from the VIMS shoreline management model are located in the shoreline management category. The shoreline management model generates preferred stabilization practices based on available GIS data. The general locations of shoreline protection structures like bulkheads, revetments, and marsh sills are mapped in the defended shoreline data layer under the subcategory existing structures. Information about mapped features like these will pop up when you click on them. This feature identification function makes it easy to identify features with multiple data layers displayed together. The top feature will be outlined like the parcel boundary on the left. The pop-up window will have more than one page of feature information if there is more than one feature on the map where you clicked. Scroll through the arrows to find each feature's information. In this example, the parcel boundary is feature 1 of 2. A forested wetland is feature 2 of 2 underneath the parcel. The entire wetland feature is highlighted to show its extent that actually goes beyond this particular parcel's boundary. Another tip is that these pop-up windows can be docked to the lower left side of the map by clicking on this docking symbol. And that moves it out of the center of the map. Now let's review where to find sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding related data layers. 10-year sea level rise scenarios are located under the main category, sea level rise, flooding, and storm surge. There are 4 sea level rise scenarios to choose from. The blue shaded areas on the map represent the projected location of mean high water under the selected scenario. Only one of the 4 scenarios can be displayed at a time. The 2017 NOAA Intermediate High scenario is the one of greatest interest and is checked on by default when the map viewer is opened for the first time. There's also a time slider bar at the bottom of the map that allows you to animate how the location of mean high water is expected to change over 10-year periods. Or you can advance through the decades on this time slider manually. At the parcel scale, the land areas shaded in blue are those areas expected to be flooded daily during high tides for the time selected. The darker shades indicate deeper inundation above the land surface. Click on a shaded area to see a table with water depth predictions in feet above the land surface at the selected point, at selected points of time. The other sea level rise layer that we've mentioned has shorter time intervals created for Chesapeake Bay Act resiliency assessments. These 5-year scenarios are located under the shoreline management category as I said, under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act subcategory. These shorter sea level rise predictions only show inundation depth on the ground greater than 6 inches. And there are no water depth tables with this data layer. One way you can apply this information is to zoom out past parcel boundaries to look for potential sea level rise impacts that might be entering the parcel from different directions, possibly not just from adjacent open water features. There is a measure tool that might be useful to help generate impact assessments and summaries. Click on the measure tool icon, the little ruler with arrows. You can select length or area, and then click and release on the map. Then you continue to draw a line or a polygon and double click to complete your measurement. The default unit is metric, and this is a standard for GIS. You can change the units by selecting from the drop-down list. When you're finished with your measurement, you can clear it from the map display by clicking on the trash can icon. There is also a potential 2050 wetlands data layer that was created for sea level rise assessments by combining the NOAA 2017 Intermediate High Sea Level Rise scenario with existing tidal and adjacent non-tidal wetlands, plus upland areas expected to be flooded daily by 2050. Again, this is one of the Bay Act specific data layers found under shoreline management. This example shown here is the same area I showed you before with connected tidal and non-tidal wetlands. The potential 2050 wetlands data layer forecasts how these wetlands are expected to shift, including how they might shift into adjacent upland areas. For storm surge assessments, storm surge is defined as the abnormal rise of water generated by a storm over and above the predicted tides. This data layer displays output from the hydrodynamic slosh model, which stands for sea, lake, and overland surges from hurricanes. This is a numerical model used by the National Weather Service to generate national storm surge risk maps with expected flood heights during different tropical storm intensities. The current model only includes categories 1 through 4, although we all know we've been experiencing more category 5 events, and there's even, I've heard mention of a category 6. For the assessments, you can select one of the tropical storm categories for your area, then click on a square to find the storm surge depth above ground, using the same identification feature function. For flooding assessments, I also wanted to mention Virginia's Flood Risk Information System. This is another acceptable model. This is maintained by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, including the information system and a mapping tool. Some of the same exact flooding-related maps are also served in the ADAPT VA interactive map. These maps are made available by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, for inclusion in mapping tools like Virginia's Flood Risk Information System and ADAPT VA. The flooding-related data layers in the ADAPT VA interactive map are located in the flooding subcategory under sea level rise, flooding, and storm surge. This is where you can find out if a parcel is located in a special flood hazard zone and where the limit of moderate wave action, or LMWA, is located in relation to a certain parcel. These data layers are served from FEMA map services with automatic updates in the ADAPT VA map viewer whenever the original source maps are updated by FEMA and the Coastal Barrier Resource System. Another main category of GIS data layers in the ADAPT VA interactive map includes protection and restoration opportunities for nature-based adaptations. Information about features that might be worth protecting can be identified under the Lands for Protection subcategory. The data layer called Coastal NNBFs, which stands for Natural and Nature-Based Features, ranks forests and wetlands according to benefits to coastal buildings. Rankings are based on a characterization of tidal flooding mitigation, how many nearby buildings will benefit from the feature, and if the feature can be used to take advantage of existing programmatic incentives. For example, FEMA's Community Rating System open space credits. Data layers under restoration opportunities include target areas for creating living shorelines with similar potential co-benefits identified. Another data layer identifies existing open turf grass areas located in the potential 2050 wetland areas. These open areas might first appear to be suitable for adaptations like planting trees or other upland adaptations. But identifying these areas as potential future wetlands can help guide tree plantings to more suitable locations where wetlands will not be migrating in the future. And that's just one example of how this data layer could be applied. So that concludes this brief overview of the ADAPT VA interactive map. For more information, you can refer to the ADAPT VA interactive map user guide with companion quick guides to the map symbols and an outline of all of the GIS data layers available. These guides are also updated as needed and will continue to be posted to this site. So whenever you click on these links, it should be the most current guides available. You can find links to these documents within the map viewer in the Help Information section. There's also a dedicated website that Circe will hopefully share the link for you in the chat. And now I'll turn it back over to Justin to present case study examples showing how these ADAPT VA data layers were applied to different scenarios.
Thank you, Karen. And hopefully you can confirm that you're now again seeing
Yes.
my.
Yes, we are. You're good to
Yeah.
go.
Excellent. So as we know, and as we heard through comments and discussions, there's been significant interest in understanding the actual application and considerations required for a resiliency assessment when a proposed development is going to occur on a property or parcel. We, as I mentioned, working with WPL to enhance the illustrations to emphasize the principles and considerations was part of the review and work done since the last revision to the guidance. In doing so, the goal is to show some common scenarios and considerations that went into place for identifying how, between proposal to final, the resiliency assessment could impact or drive that decision. The examples I'll present are designed to be illustrative, as outlined in the examples document and as highlighted by Karen. Additional information and resources are available to help guide localities in that decision. And when you're looking at the available tools and options to a locality, just now under the Bay Act for options to address a proposal that can vary. These are designed to provide examples of where using the information from the assessment as outlined in the requirements and the accompanying guidance and tools, we show a proposal to final and highlight those common principles and consideration. In the first scenario, we looked at a new principal structure and accessory structures as proposed on a parcel of land. This parcel of land was not identified as being pre-Bay Act lot, which was covered in additional examples in an example that I'll cover. In this particular instance, the actual proposal, as you might commonly encounter, included not only a primary structure, but accessory structures, including a pool and pool deck, as well as a gazebo, with the parcel line depicting and showing the available lines for the 50-foot and 100-foot buffer, showing the site design as proposed along with the existing conditions. One of the elements of consideration when looking at the assessment is the time frame, and as outlined in the examples and the guidance, that is based upon the information available and can commonly be determined based upon resources, specifications, or the nature of the type of structure itself. In this instance, we use as an example from common information and the type of structure, looking at a primary residence for a 30-year lifespan, a pool of 25 to 30 years, and the gazebo of 10 to 15 years, and applied a 2050 assessment, particularly given the primary residence inclusion in the proposal. Then applying both the layers that we've spoken about and Karen walked through of the intermediate high scenario that's available in ADAPT VA, showing the sea level rise for the 2050 projection, as well as looking at and considering those areas that are inclusive of having significant anticipated sea level rise, identified as applying the 6 inches or above, as Karen mentioned, and depicting that as to how it may intersect with the proposal, particularly the primary structure, pool, and the gazebo that was proposed to be located closer to the shoreline. Using the tools such as measuring and the proposal as provided, saw approximately 3.5 feet to 6 inches moving landward projected from the feature, and that based upon a placement, final placement and proposal lot size, the house is likely, and particularly the proposed accessory structures, to be impacted by 6 inches to 1.5 feet. Then applied looking at the intersection of storm surge, applying a category 2, as would have to be determined by the locality reviewing a project. So 0 to 6 across the seaward 50. With the potential based upon the final placement of the proposed development of 0 to 2 inches likely to be impacting, particularly the proposed accessory structures. Then applied the flooding. The flooding identified for this area was zone AE and primarily shown and as depicted both from the available layers as demonstrated by Karen and referenced in the proposal, moves into the landward 50 feet. And again, shows potential impact to the house and the proposed structures. But as you can see, and as commonly encountered in a lot of proposals, the proposed location can be actually altered or adjusted without additional requirements, including adaptation measures or structural requirements, because sufficient space exists, in fact, outside of the entire RPA for all the proposed development, and in fact becomes a non-RPA development. This example highlights that applying traditional Bay Act principles and requirements with the location and placement of proposed development may sufficiently, and in most cases, address any potential considerations relative to the assessment and those potential impacts. And indeed, documents that relocation of proposals, including without requiring additional measures or conditions, can sufficiently address those considerations from an impact. Another example that may be frequently encountered is a much smaller parcel size, and particularly a proposal relative to those parcel size for what is identified as a pre-Bay Act lot, or as specified under the regulations, a parcel that was recorded prior to the October 1, 1989 date, and has for an allowance of an administrative review for approval and consideration of the primary development. In this scenario, based on the parcel size, the proposed primary structure or house is entirely within the RPA, and in fact, based on parcel size, could be proposed to be located between the 50 and 100. Scenarios obviously may vary based upon parcel size and proposed primary structure, but this is designed to highlight a scenario that may be encountered dealing with a primary structure in a pre-backed lot. Considering only a proposal of a primary residence, again, given the type of structure being proposed, it was a 30-year consideration for lifespan and a 2050 assessment. Again, evaluation was considered with the extent of approximation as demonstrated through ADAPT Virginia, applying the intermediate high curve scenario and a 2050 projection of approximately 3.5 feet to 6 inches moving landward, being able to use the data and tools as Karen discussed. And that likely based upon final house placement and parcel size, you could have an impact to the house of 6 inches to 1.5 feet. Again, you see a similar scenario as demonstrated before where these impacts occur of storm surge. Again, applying a category 2 as would have to be determined by the locality, you see 0 to 6 feet. And as Karen highlighted, that information can be determined through the data that's attached to the layers available in ADAPT Virginia. And that likely based upon final approximation and location of the house, you would have 0 to 2 feet impact. Similarly, most of the parcel is covered by a flood zone AE across the vast extent, especially that space available for any proposed development and project area. Again, that information can be determined as shown by Karen through ADAPT Virginia or FRIS, and indicates and shows, consistent with the floodplain management designations, the flood zone, as well as you can see depicted, the limit of moderate wave action anticipated to have on the parcel as well. In this type of scenario, we understand that traditional Bay Act principles with relocation, resizing, and so forth may not address all considerations for impact. This is a scenario that localities may encounter where they can still look at other tools and considerations and options available, such as conditions relative to a setback variance, taking into consideration the proposed development, parcel size, and the setback requirements, but also highlights where structural elevations or designs of the house to minimize the potential of impact, particularly from storm surge flooding, can help to address and the appropriate conditions for this proposal. Additionally, given the relocation and resizing, which may not address all impacts, additional supplemental buffer mitigation, including potential nature-based adaptation measures, would be an appropriate condition for consideration, given the inability to completely resize or relocate the proposed development. Those most extreme scenarios, such as significant impact across the parcel or availability, location of proposed development, would be those recognized for needing the additional identified requirements under the regulations for conditions such as structural engineering requirements or conditions relative to adaptation measures. As identified in the regulations and guidance, localities may have additional requirements relative to zoning or floodplain or structural enhancements that may be considered as a part of this to address those impacts as well. Another example that may be encountered is a new principal structure, inclusive of a water-dependent facility, in this particular case, a boathouse and pier, to have access to the waterfront from the parcel. This examined looking at the proposed house with a pier, boathouse, and even an additional accessory structure of a pool within the limits of the RPA as proposed. Again, looking at the lifespan of those proposed types of structures, the residence was considered and examined at 30 years, a pool at 25 to 30, a wooden pier at 20 to 25, and a boathouse at 15 to 25, both considerate of materials and type of design. And 2050 assessment was applied. Again, looking at the projection, you see an average of about 1 foot landward at the most extent. This is not an uncommon scenario across many parcels where there is sea level rise projected, that it is mostly limiting towards the shoreline or a limited portion landward. And that extent of potential impact is shown here using Adapt Virginia, and the tools and information shows approximately 1 foot. That is not shown to have an impact to the proposed development relative to the pool and to the house, but certainly and may be commonly encountered where sea level rise is projected to occur on a parcel to impact water dependent facilities. The category 1 as applied, chosen by a locality, would be at 1 foot, again, mostly along the shoreline, with category 2 indicating a potential up to 6 to 7 feet. In this indication, I've shown applied a different layer, as Karen mentioned, which is the contour line, so that you can examine those relative to the topography of a parcel. Again, the impact is identified as being entirely to the water dependent facility. Similarly, based upon the location, it is within a flood zone, but it is identified as A, and that flooding is largely limited to the buffer area as established. And again, flooding most likely limited to the proposed water dependent facility. Based upon the actual specific proposed location of the primary structure of the house, there is limited potential impact of flooding there as well. Again, applying traditional Bay Act standards and principles, the primary structures can and should be, regardless, shifted out of the RPA where sufficient room and location exists and the buffer maintained. That can provide a key element in this scenario and in many scenarios to help mitigate and address potential impacts. With water-dependent facilities, though, consideration as to elevation and design to address those increased water levels, such as floating, structural considerations, or elevated structures to minimize the need for going in and modifying or encroaching upon the buffer in the future based upon that impact is the key consideration and can be incorporated as a part of that final site design consistent with the application of the assessment. Again, those are just some common high-level examples. There are certainly several scenarios that localities may encounter across the 84 localities implementing the Bay Act that may require additional considerations or scenarios or examples. Just hitting at a high level, some of those, and there are additional examples provided for in the accompanying examples to the guidance document, are considerations around redevelopment. Redevelopment as recognized for development over a proposed existing impervious area. Again, the type of redevelopment could be and would be a key factor when looking at the opportunity and necessity for additional considerations, including structural or otherwise. But again, most commonly, similar principles that you would apply for primary structure development could exist, such as relocation, resizing, or structural considerations. For structure additions, which is an example included in the accompanying guidance as well, similar principles apply, particularly with structural additions. Those provide a key opportunity for conditions where evaluating relocation or resizing of the addition may be able to sufficiently address those potential impacts based upon parcel space, and again, consistent with standard Bay Act principles. Localities have and do identify intensely developed areas throughout the localities. The two primary distinctions that accompany an intensely developed area is the allowance for development, not just redevelopment, but also for allow localities to have flexibility or discretion around the establishment of a vegetative buffer. But when looking at intensely developed areas within the context of a resiliency assessment, one important part as what might drive an intensely developed area is the existence or significant source or amount of impervious area that the shoreline erosion control allowance remains. And so therefore, where you're dealing with an intensely developed area with significant pervious area, and best technical advice would not indicate that a living shoreline would be feasible. A hardened structure to address resiliency necessity would be recognized. Additionally, even though IDAs may significantly include large areas of impervious areas, localities have the ability and have established vegetation in the RPA areas, and that would be a key factor for consideration as well. Again, maintenance, improvement, or expansion of a buffer or vegetation may in itself provide a mitigative option for addressing the resiliency impacts. Within adaptation measures and living shorelines, certainly and inclusive of the examples attached to the guidance, questions may arise as to how that would drive or determine consideration there. As you saw from the tools and information from Adapt Virginia, really those considerations and impacts help to guide that implementation measure, particularly being helpful for looking at the location of the adaptation measure or extent or location of living shoreline, as well as the planting types. For example, in consideration of the potential impact from sea level rise, VIMS has available information and technical assistance relative to dynamic living shorelines, which may help to guide and aid in examining the extent, location, and plantings. It's not intended to deter or indicate that a living shoreline or measure is not appropriate, but rather to guide the implementation in those considerations. Frequently, localities, as you look at and evaluate sea level rise across the many available years of projection, will see little or no impact, or frequently encounter a parcel where the impact may be more limiting, such as the example that was discussed with regards to the primary structure and water dependent facility, that it's buffer only if you didn't have the water dependent facility. Again, the resiliency assessment there would really guide more the mitigation that may be associated or that would be required for the proposed development in the buffer area and provide guidance and assistance on the location and types of planning, particularly considering how far landward the sea level rise may extend over that projected period and aid in looking at how the mitigation is implemented within the buffer, even if there's no impact to the actual proposed development structures. Some key points to close and consider and ultimately outlined in the guidance and tools as we discuss this more, both with localities looking to implement and stakeholders who are interested in the application, is that many localities and RPA features may have little or no impact. And as identified in the implementation checklist, localities should, as a first step, look at the extent of projections for sea level rise in their area. In evaluating, considering examples and scenarios, we looked at several parcels across many localities and actually encountered some challenges in identifying a parcel with significant, particularly sea level rise, to illustrate a more extreme scenario of a direct impact to development. So this evaluation is a key step and will help guide localities in many other decision making. And that given the nature of those impacts and particularly sea level rise to be considered, there may be little or no impact across a vast majority or significant portion of CVPA parcels. Most commonly and frequently, scenarios involving looking at the impacts and resiliency assessments can and should be addressed through traditional Bay Act principles, which the examples and tools and guidance were designed to underscore. In particular, where site conditions and proposals consider, even for primary structures, the ability to relocate out of the 100-foot buffer to look at resizing, and in many cases often consider the buffer planning and mitigation to be able to address those impacts, either in the location, extent, or amount of buffer, all of which can help to aid the parcel that might be impacted. Those principles existed before the requirement of resiliency assessments and consideration of the impacts to again minimize the extent of encroachment into an RPA, as well as to support maintenance of a vegetative 100-foot buffer around those RPA features. Additionally, as indicated in the regulations and accompanying guidance and the tools that are provided, locality programs or requirements may address impacts separately. As mentioned, zoning or setback requirements or variances thereto may be a consideration or a tool for localities when evaluating how to address impacts. Additionally, building requirements, particularly related to storm surge and other impacts, may already be incorporated elsewhere into localities' requirements for building. Those can all serve as tools and be identified as measures to address those impacts. Additionally, while flooding is identified as an impact for consideration, the goal there is to reconcile and ensure that activities are consistent across floodplain management requirements, and that those floodplain management requirements may indeed, consistent with the implementation by the locality, address those impacts as well. All of those separate requirements that might be identified elsewhere, even outside of the Bay Act, are an option for localities to consider or identify for addressing impacts. As noted and covered today, there are several features and information available in ADAPT Virginia that may aid localities in their implementation or consideration of resiliency assessments. Again, like with many of the tools provided, it is not indicated to be a directive to localities, as many features and layers are informative but not required. Being able to provide and identify all available tools and information for the assistance with localities and implementation is a key consideration. But across all those tools and information presented today, the goal is to work with localities through the implementation and consideration of those impacts that are required to provide the most straightforward and easiest means to identify and consider those impacts as they incorporate resiliency assessment into their programs. Additional allowances continue to remain, and the traditional Bay Act principles continue to apply with regards to considering proposals of development within the resource protection areas. As mentioned, concerns or questions relative to other portions of the implementation of the overall Bay Act resiliency amendments, such as adaptation measures, recognize that the erosion and sediment control provision still is remained untouched, and that other considerations such as water quality impact through water quality impact assessment and principles and policies relative to limiting the number of times of buffer encroachments or modifications and serial exceptions exist and are really consistent with considerations relative to a resiliency impact and its assessment. So with that, we are going to turn to questions. I believe there are some questions that have been identified through the Q&A. Carried over, we will touch on those, and then I open it up for others to be able to provide additional questions and answers. Again, as noted, we understand that folks and individual stakeholders and localities may have specific comments, requests, or otherwise relative to the guidance, tools, and the overall Bay Act resiliency assessment. We certainly look forward and encourage folks to submit those and look forward to hearing that feedback. But please do so through the comment submission process so that we can make sure that we have that captured throughout and are able to address those comments. So I'm going to go to the questions here. One question that came through: is there any way to exclude certain BMPs that do not work well with the local environment? Again, as with all elements of the Bay Act resiliency and requirements, localities certainly can, looking at and considering either broad requirements, or proposals, consider what is most appropriate for a site. And so therefore, and in fact recognized in the regulatory amendments because of concerns over potential impact to community flood programs, credits, first and foremost, localities are not required to adopt the allowance of adaptation measures, but even beyond that, localities should and can consider within the universe of identified BMPs, those that are appropriate or that are consistent with other requirements within the locality. Setback variances owing to environmental considerations are not, to my knowledge, currently allowable basis for a variance. What efforts are underway to change the state enabling legislation to allow such variances? Again, variances, setback requirements, and those considerations are all part of the local program. We do identify that as a potential option. Obviously, any activity proposal that the locality considers or is provided should be consistent with any other zoning or locality requirements. And we continue to work with localities to help identify opportunities for reconciling additional requirements in the localities, zoning, subdivision, planning, or other ordinances to be able to address these assessments. Next, our RPA buffers as shown in the examples. The RPA buffers provided by the localities, or is this layer coming from somewhere else? If the layer is not the one from the locality, could pose challenges for consistency and accuracy of submittals from applicants. So the RPA buffers as shown in the example is specific to the parcels that we identified, consistent with the locality they were identified from, based upon prior comments and certainly considerations when you're providing scenarios or examples. We did remove labeling information, but we did ensure that there was a reconciliation both from the information obtained from the resiliency considerations as well as site-specific considerations were reflected accurately. And I believe Heather spoke to that as well with regards to a question regarding buffers and RPA. So with that, I understand that there may be additional folks with questions. We'll provide the opportunity. And Karen, I leave that to you and others if there's an ideal scenario to ensure that we have the opportunity now to open it up for other questions from folks.
Sure, Justin. If there is anybody who would like to ask a question that is not typed into the chat or the Q&A, which is an easy way to send those questions in, you can use the raise hand function, and that's located under reactions. And then we can call on you that way. You will come to the top of the gallery. And there is another question, Justin, from Kristen.
Awesome, thank you. Do localities have the flexibility to apply local risk assessment studies related to climate change? So localities are required to consider and implement the resiliency as identified in the regulations relative to consideration, for example, of the NOAA sea level rise intermediate high scenario and applying the lifespan as required. Having said that, if there are additional tools or information, be it local programs or otherwise, that aid or guide those decision-making and working with applicants and are still consistent with ensuring that the regulatory amendments or regulatory requirements are met, those are certainly an option as well. And that's goal is to, as we highlighted with the Adapt Virginia overview, is that there are a lot of resources available that can be both helpful and informative to both applicants, localities, and others looking to address those resiliency impacts.
And we have a hand raised by Lewis's iPad.
Yes, good morning. Justin, this is Louis.
Hey, Louis.
So this is more kind of a general compare and contrast. Most of the presumption in this is that you seem to be expecting Mother Nature to just take what she wants over time. These properties all have mortgages. for the most part, on them. And so homeowners are going to want to hold with the current conditions that are on their property today. And there doesn't seem to be any scenarios that recognize that holding in place, although I think we all recognize long-term is going to be a futile exercise, people will want to hold in place, and they are not going to voluntarily allow Mother Nature to take. So that poses some unusual complications where if the process becomes true draconian, they're going to build a wall at the 101 line, and they're going to drown everything waterward out to make sure that they don't have to be forced backwards from where they are today. And so I'd like a little
Sure.
explanation around how you all want to handle that juxtaposition between people and mortgages and holding in place versus the entire programmatic structure, which is not working in that direction.
Well, I think there's a couple of considerations I would point to there, and I think Louis certainly some of that speaks to comment on the Bay Act resiliency going back to the statute requirements, and from there, that certainly look forward to seeing as well for consideration and the comment submittals from you and others. A couple of highlights I would note, especially with regards to the stay in place versus not, is, as you know, application of a resiliency consideration and these impacts are really when there is a proposal, right? So there's not forced action where, for example, someone already has a house that would be existing, of course, because that wouldn't trigger any sort of additional consideration at all under the Bay Act. With regards to beyond that, though, I mean, when you talk about a scenario, for example, of a house, right, with the addition scenario and the example that we provided, then I think, again, it's not about moving or changing what might be pre-existing, but there's still consideration that recognize that, but still applying traditional Bay Act principles of resizing and relocating can address those impacts. The other piece I would also mention too, to the point with regards to 100 feet, certainly understood. I mean, I think that's a scenario though across the entire Bay Act. When you have any law or regulation, you have to define and the contours and the boundaries and limits of that, whether it's a speed limit, right, set at 65 miles an hour, or in the Bay Act scenario, 100-foot buffer. And so even before resiliency as a consideration, with the statutory amendment change came into place, what was allowed at the 101 foot was and has been different than that with what you can and can't do within the 100 foot. And that's really tied back to those existing principles. I think what we want to try to emphasize is that in the application of the assessment, when you're talking about someone proposing to have an encroachment in particular or propose a structure in that RPA, that those traditional Bay Act principles with regards to relocation and consideration of the parcel size existed even before resiliency and can really drive a lot of that decision making. We know not every situation is going to be the same. And so working with you all and seeing comments around any additional specific scenario concerns or specific BMP considerations, you know, I think is going to continue to be a key part of this discussion, as well as consideration of the comments that come through. I think we had a couple of more comments or questions. One, the regulations require impacts be evaluated based on the potential impact range of 30 years or lifespan. Justin mentioned using common information to form a time frame for a structure. How does the guidance address the sources of common information to ensure consistency of lifespans for specific structures? E.g., where would one look to determine a gazebo will last 10 to 15 years? It's a great question. Typically, industry specifics or standards or information will provide that. I think one of the key considerations is at the forefront, the type and nature of the actual proposed structure itself, right? To the earlier point, a house is designed at least to last as long as that identified times or lifespan. I think where it may be a bit more nuanced is around accessory structures. And that's where I think as long as there's reliable specific information that can come from industry, common scenarios regarding those structures elsewhere that come into play when you're looking at building considerations and elsewhere, can all be a guide around that information. Additionally, the permanency or the design permanency of the proposed development or structure itself. Again, a house lending towards entirely intended to be a more permanent structure versus something like a gazebo, which may be intended to be there, but whose lifespan, given the materials that are built with, would certainly be a bigger driver in that case. Additional question, obviously local programs are going to need training to implement changes. Will DEQ be identifying gaps in providing training to locality staff? Absolutely. We'll talk about some of that in our next steps, including additional stakeholder outreach, additional training that we'll be doing, and some additional one-on-ones with localities. Again, just trying to work with folks, understanding that, especially as I mentioned with sea level rise, impacts varying, and scenarios and parcels that folks may encounter different, being different, really working to speak to and assist localities with their individual localities' needs and questions as well. So I'll turn it back to Karen or Heather if I think we've covered those provided.
I do not see any other questions. Oh no, there's Bob Kerr asking if we can go back to the gazebo.
Sure. You're
In
gonna
the chat.
test my technology. That was the first scenario. Yes, and I guess the question relative to that.
It says it appeared the gazebo was only affected by surge from a Category 2 storm, which is rare. And if its construction is only 30-year timeline, cannot it stay where proposed?
Well, so I think, Bob, what I would highlight there is, again, with all of these structures, given the site size and parcel and available space, that showed it shifting. I think what your question emphasizes is that certainly when you're looking at those impacts with much more limiting opportunity for location, setting aside the consideration separately for accessory structure, then that might be an opportunity. I think what we're reinforcing here is that, again, consistent with Bay Act principles, consideration as to placement in the buffer should be can be connected to the size of parcel and available space outside of an RP. Test my limits going forward. Great. And so with that, I did want to just, I'm going to pause out of my screen. I'm going to show the tools and make sure folks have access and information as to where all this additional guidance and tools are located. And then we'll talk about some next steps as well. Certainly not the end of the conversation or opportunity to provide a training or assistance, but wanted to provide some information available to folks. Before I do that, I believe I see Louis, you have your hand raised if there's additional questions.
You need to unmute yourself, Louis.
Yeah, thank you. I want to follow on Bob's question because that just triggered something else. Virginia has not been hit by a direct category anything storm in probably 200 years. Most of the storms that when they show up are, a nor'easter or a tropical depression because they've given out. And so I'm interested in y'all's thinking around the nexus between planning for something that hasn't happened and is not documentable in terms of happening because there's no data to show it has happened. It just kind of sets up for an unusual construct where I understand the rationale for why you want to do it. But if you go backwards in time and look, we haven't been hit by those storms. So you're asking communities to plan for something that hasn't happened. I don't know how to reconcile that.
Well, I think as outlined, that's part of why in the requirements, and as you see often, a couple of points I would say to that. One is, as you see often with the consideration and overlay of impacts, storm surge and flooding and extent of sea level rise area typically very much reconcile. But to that point, also why flexibility and allowance for locality to look at that category certainly can vary, and that's why that was recognized in and provides for that allowance for category selection by the locality In the guidance, we talk about some resources for looking at that. I know certainly frequency, to your point, is a consideration, and EPA and others has some information on that. I think certainly the goal here is to recognize, though, that storm surge can vary across localities, certainly in those areas that does tend to align with where more sea level rise significance is anticipated. It is anticipated to see storm surge increase as well. I know some localities actually, because of storm surge already in considerations, have additional structural requirements, for example, to address that component. So again, I don't think it's a one size fits all, but it is an element for consideration with reconciliation of the impacts for the assessment. And again, provided for localities to consider and select that category based upon the specifics of their location and consideration of that frequency as well. So I just want to share real quick and show folks. And we're just going to go with my screen, and hopefully you're seeing that. And so again, all of this was available and posted on our DEQ website, but we do have the resiliency assessment, again, tailored to provide and design information that would make up for and consider for conducting a resiliency assessment. And again, guiding folks through a more typical process for questions and narrative information to speak to those requirements. You should be able to find and access the model ordinance. Again, identified, and as said earlier, this provides a full kind of model ordinance, but outlines and underscores those language that are the language that is inclusive directly tied to regulatory amendments. The standalone example guidance that provides the steps, both in terms of the information and tied to what was presented with ADAPT Virginia and those available resources, as well as the steps for conducting, and then the illustrations and the additional examples that I referenced. The implementation checklist, again, designed to aid localities as a more stepwise process through the regulations, but most importantly, and regardless of carrying forward directly the model ordinance, provides some key consideration for those determination and decision points for localities when they're looking at that implementation requirement. The checklist in a similar fashion with the information tied towards the requirements in a standard fashion for submission from an applicant or someone requesting an adaptation measure, and then the guidance, of course, itself. And all of this, as most folks were able to access, comes directly off of DEQ's website under the Chesapeake Bay program. And there we have these tools as well as the additional information available, including contacts for our localities and liaisons if folks have individual questions or want to reach out relative to this or anything else, as well as these tools available for folks to take a look at. And you'll see all of that on our website here with drop downs included for assistance, program oversight, compliance, local regulations, and guidance, including that additional information as mentioned. So I do want to talk about.
Justin, there is a hand raised. Patrick Fanning has a hand raised.
All right, okay, let me go back. Yes, Patrick.
Hey, Justin, thanks. Just one more question, and maybe it's more of a comment, and certainly will memorialize it in writing. But in the examples, it doesn't seem like there are any examples that just focus on an adaptation measure not associated with a structure other than the living shoreline. And as you know, the living shorelines in the regulation are treated a little bit differently. So I guess the question is, are there any other places, I'm trying to wade through all the different documents, where a standalone adaptation measure example is included that would lay out the process for a locality when all that a property owner is trying to do is implement an adaptation measure that doesn't have the specific sort of carve outs associated with the living shoreline.
Yeah, so I think so a couple of things I would highlight is there are a couple of other examples, as you note, including living shorelines. There is the adaptation measure checklist, which is really the key tool designed to kind of walk through those requirements where you've got a standalone proposal just relative to an adaptation measure, including both the type of measure as well as the fill. I mean, I think certainly we'll be receiving comments on additional scenarios and um, scenarios or examples that folks might encounter, and we can find a best way to address those without obviously recognizing being able to speak to every type of scenario, especially since some common principles may cut across, and as well as in the guidance, of course, the additional clarification provided around adaptation measures as well for considering those. But there is not a specific separate illustrated example, I guess more directly to your question. Certainly, as I said, consideration of additional scenarios or examples is something we can look at so we get feedback or engage with individuals, localities one-on-one, but the checklist is designed to speak to that type of standalone request or scenario as well.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions in the chat or the Q&A or any other raised hands. Justin, would you like to show your next steps?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you all again. We appreciate the participation today, and we understand the continued interest and need for both clarity and is provided for and around this process, the guidance and the tools, as well as working with localities and stakeholders. And again, this is not the end of any conversation or opportunity to engage on this particular issue. But we do have certainly a framework and next steps outlined. As I showed, you're able to access directly on our website, our page under the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act program for local program regulations and guidance, where all of these documents as mentioned, as well as information on submitting and comment is provided. That period does run till May 3rd. As I mentioned, consistent with prior requests, we wanted to have an opportunity to have the documents out available to individuals, provide this webinar to provide additional detail and a bit more around Adapt Virginia and an overview, and still have opportunity for folks to have that context when considering or submitting comments. So that period runs till May 3rd. Certainly we'll take a look and engage with individual stakeholders and localities as we look at those comments and make revisions consistent with the structure now in Virginia. For any finalization, particularly for the guidance, there's a separate process that would have to occur as well. That would be a follow-up. We are planning additional Adapt Virginia training in person for localities, as well as providing a virtual option for those localities. That's again designed for considerative scenarios or examples, even including particular parcels or prior proposals to understand the context for applying the assessment and looking at and using Adapt Virginia. So there's going to be additional trainings, and certainly that's in addition to individual opportunities and technical assistance or trainings to localities one-on-one or otherwise as well. And that's all part of our additional plan to do outreach and training, including working with localities, engagements and check-ins with implementation, looking at and talking about the sea level rise projections for those localities. As I mentioned, that can certainly vary as you look across our many localities in the Bay Act. So having an understanding and engaging on the extent of those projections and how that might interplay with common proposals or questions that locality has is important, as well as providing technical assistance on ordinance and implementation itself, including reviewing proposed ordinance changes, forms, processes, or other portions of the locality's implementation. And of course, to provide technical assistance as we do now on any specific projects or questions that localities may have now or into the future. We understand that this is a new component of a Bay Act proposal and consideration, and our goal is ultimately to work with localities and to share information and tools to best aid them as we can and provide as much assistance both technical or otherwise in implementation, generally with the BAC program, and of course with these new requirements. So with that, we do thank everyone for their time today. Apologies for any technical considerations. We understand there's many folks or other folks who may not be able to have attended. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded. We will post both a link to this webinar as well as the PowerPoint slides on our website to provide that additional tool and information to individuals as they're looking at these guidance and tools or have questions. I certainly encourage all stakeholders, whether it's from localities, planning district commissions, roundtables, NGOs, or otherwise, to reach out with any specific questions as a follow-up, and certainly look forward to all comments and feedbacks that we can receive to make sure that we produce the best guidance, tools, and information for our localities. If you do have, and we are engaging, as I mentioned, individually with localities or other organizations, opportunities, or wish to engage with us more on answering questions, we're happy to do that as well. Please just don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Heather. Additionally, localities can work through their liaisons as well, with that information posted on our website. I want to thank Karen and Pam and the team at VIMS for their assistance today, not only with the training, but setting this up and all the great feedback and training and opportunity they provided to us throughout this process.
You're very welcome, Justin. It's a pleasure to work with DEQ on this effort as well, and glad to see so many participants on today's session. We hope we find it useful, and we look forward to maybe seeing some of you at trainings in the future. So thank you so much, everybody, and have an excellent day.
Thank you all.